Have you ever noticed how the word risk comes up again and again during pregnancy conversations, and how quickly it can overshadow joy, confidence, and even pleasure in the experience of birth? What if you could rethink the way we talk about risk and clear the path for something far more empowering? Hi, I'm Debra Pascali-Bonaro, director and host of the Orgasmic Birth Podcast. And today I'm joined by someone who I've been following for many years. I recommend her books and resources in all my workshops. So it is truly a pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Sara Wickham. She is a best-selling author, speaker, and researcher who works independently. Sara is the director of the Birth Information Project. Her career has been varied and includes 3 decades of experience as a midwife, lecturer, and researcher. She is the author, editor of 18 books and has edited 3 midwifery journals and lectured in more than 30 countries. Sara provides consultancy services for midwifery and health-related organizations around the world, and she is joining us today from Southwest England. Sara, it is truly such a joy and pleasure to welcome you here today, because I truly am such a fan of you and all your wisdom and work.
I'm very much a fan of yours too, and it's lovely to see you. And thank you for waiting until I could do that. And also, I have to tell everyone, you are up so early to talk to me. You've got up especially early and had an extra coffee, which which I really appreciate. So it's lovely to be here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, I'm loving having my coffee with you this morning for sure. So, there's so much we can talk about, but I know that you are the person I really go to and follow, because so many conversations, as I said in the intro, around pregnancy center on risk, sometimes to the point that the joy and the confidence and the pleasure are overshadowed. Why do you think this has become so common? And can you talk about the impact this has on women's experiences?
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many reasons, and our culture generally, over the last couple of 100 years, really has become increasingly focused on risk as a narrative, as a touch point in our culture. And you can trace it back to about the late 1700s. But we've always known that life was dangerous. It's by definition, things are dangerous and there are things out there that can go wrong. But actually focusing on them, focusing on the risk, the chance that something can go wrong, is a relatively new thing in our culture. But it's everywhere now, and it's used to sell things, to sell ideas. We see a lot of risk-focused messaging. If you look at the media, we have really scary headlines. Journalists know that in order to get people to read their work, they need to find titles for their articles, for things that are going to stimulate and make us click. And it would be lovely if what made us click and read these things were the happy emotions. But what we know from research is that actually fear motivates us to click and to do things and take action more than anything else. And I think that's built in now to everything. We see these, risk-based sales tactics in so many things. Insurance. Probably everybody listening to the podcast has several types of insurance, and this is a relatively new thing. And so risk is everywhere. Risk is everywhere in our culture. And the in pregnancy and in birth, it's ubiquitous. Everyone is now told, every woman is now hearing you're at risk, you're high risk, you're low risk. I don't know whether you've noticed, but nobody ever gets told they're no risk.
Yeah.
And and this is because actually no risk doesn't exist. No matter what you do, even if you decide, I mean, I'm sat here in my office in a semi-rural part of Southwest England, as you said, and I'd feel pretty safe, but actually there is a chance that a meteorite could come flying out of space, and,
Right.
and even if I said, well, I don't like risk, so I want to be really safe and I'm just going to go to bed well, actually, then I've got a risk of developing a deep vein thrombosis from just, we can't get away from risk. And so I think there's a couple of different things that we can do. We can either, and this is very much the focus of my work, we can try and put that risk in context and look for ways to deal with our culture's obsession with risk and people's use of it to try and persuade other people to do certain things. Or you can, as people often do in our culture, use this to try and push people down certain pathways to get you to sign up for things. I don't think people always realize they're doing it. It's just become such a dominant narrative in our culture. And so, yes, a lot of the work that I do is around helping women and families to understand what's actually going on here, and to, to sort of dig into that and say, it's not as scary as you think. And I mean, it was really interesting when you emailed me and said, will you come on the podcast? I mean, I've told you this. My first thought was, I would love to. It would be lovely to see you, but what can I say? My work isn't about pleasure and joy. I wish it was. It's about, how do you say no to an induction and what's the evidence? And then I thought, actually, I'm wrong, because my work is totally kind of aligned with yours, because you have to clear the risk out of the way. Risk steals, the focus on risk steals the joy from pregnancy and birth. In the research I've done over the years, so many women and midwives have used that phrase or similar phrases and said it just steals the joy.
Yes.
I remember going to the cinema with my husband a few years ago. I can't remember what we were going to see, but I sat down and I remembered, and I just got this shock because I'd lit a candle, a scented candle on my desk, and I'd left it on, and I just sat down and went, oh, and luckily, and I mean, that's not a high risk activity, but as you can probably see him in the picture, we do have a cat who is quite clumsy. And so luckily we have a wonderful neighbour who has keys, and I just phoned her and said, could you please just slip in and blow them? And so 2 minutes later she'd solved the problem. And that was brilliant, because if she hadn't been there, or she hadn't had keys, I wouldn't have been able to enjoy the film, because I would have been worrying. And I think that what this story shows is how, if you are focused on the risk, or you're worried, or you're anxious about what's going to go wrong, that is taking up too much of your brain. I'm not going to go into the physiology, but it exists. I'm sure you've had people talking about that on the podcast. And we need to actually get that stuff out of the way. We need to deal with it and put it into perspective so that we can clear the path
Yeah.
to the joy and pleasure.
Yeah. And I'm so happy that you brought that together, because I couldn't agree with you more, right? And
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
one of our mutual friends, midwife Robin Lim, always says people are getting scare rather than care, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
that scare is really that risk card that I feel like they're always got a handful of risk cards they're handing you.
Totally. And no matter, you can actually pull a risk card for pretty much any woman now. There almost nobody is now left in the low risk. Like I said, no risk isn't even a thing. It there can always, if you have the kind of care provider, and they're not necessarily doing it to be unkind or mean, or because they want to just get to the golf course. The thing is that the care providers, and I'm sure a lot of care providers like myself will be listening as well, we are just as affected by the scary messaging in our culture, and sometimes we need to hear these things as much as the women and families in our care do. I get so many emails from midwives and birth workers and obstetricians who say, I'm so grateful for whatever it was that I've given them the evidence on, um, in a book or blog post, because they hadn't realized that. They had thought that something was really risky because it's what they'd been taught.
Yes. And I'm so glad you said that, because I think sometimes, we don't have the empathy for people that aren't providers, for what the providers are going through as well, and also sharing in that. So you've also said that understanding the evidence around risk can actually be empowering. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I like to do in my books, I mean, I'm not sure whether you know this about me, but excuse me, I'm so sorry. I'm just going to remove the cat from the camera because we can share, but it's not all for him. So one of the things that I have always done is gone to the evidence to look at what the actual risk of things are, and I find over and over again that the what's being conveyed to women and families isn't necessarily quite true, and it's not quite kind of what, what's. So I think it's really important, and this is a huge part of my work, is that the bit, sorry, I was going to say, and I got distracted by the cat. I came into midwifery having gone to do medicine and then gone, actually no, these are not my people. These are lovely people, but they're not my people. So I have this science and maths background, and that's not, there aren't many midwives that love maths as much as I do. And so I'm really happy to go and dive into the numbers in those research studies and analyze them, sometimes more deeply than actually has been shown in the results of the study, because you get a limited amount of space, and then put those into context. And I think what often happens is that, well, there's two things that often happen. We get told the relative risk of something. So women are told, well, if you do this, your baby is twice as likely to die as if you do this. And that sounds terribly scary. And of course you're going to do whatever it is they've said. But then when you look at the data, sometimes what you find is that actually the risk went from 1 in a million to 1 in 500,000. And it's still extraordinarily unlikely. And actually, there are also downsides of the thing that you're being told you need to do. And then there might be other things about you that mean that you're far less at risk than most people. And all of that stuff around the actual just being told, oh, you're twice as likely or 4 times as likely to have this happen. I think it's really important to put that we look at actual statistics, which is a lot of what I try and do in my work. And I say, this is the chart. If you are in this situation, this is the chance. And if you decide to do this, this is the chance. Often there isn't any evidence actually to make a difference. And then I try and talk about the personal factors. This is why I write books and not just social media posts, because you need to deep dive. This is one of the things that drives me nuts, just to go on a tangent about our culture, is we were talking about this earlier. People just want, well, not everybody, lots of people want things compressed into one sentence.
Yes.
And somebody said to me on social media the other day, can you just compress this into a paragraph? Well, no, I can't. If I could do that, I wouldn't need to write, books. So there's actually lots more information that we can look at rather than just this, this relative risk. And another thing that I think is really useful to know is that often, and again, I'm not going to blame care providers, because often they've been taught this and don't have the time to go and look at the statistics in depth. But often even the relative risk is far less than we've been told to believe. So here's another example. I mean, if it's sunny, it looks like it's sunny in New Jersey today. I don't know if it is, but if it's sunny today,
it is.
And you have an errand to do, and it's not an urgent errand, but it's something you want to do in your car. I'm assuming you probably wouldn't think twice about the risk when you get in your car and go and do your errand. We all know
Right.
that everything carries a risk. But let me ask you, if it just started to rain, just very slightly, you're not even sure whether you need a coat on or not, but does that change your thinking about whether you'd go out? Most people,
No, not at all.
Most people would still go out. Let's take it to another extreme though. If there was a massive thunderstorm, and I don't know what weather events you get in New Jersey, but hurricanes, tornadoes,
Yes.
really bad, would that change your thinking about going out for a non-urgent errand?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. We live near the beach and we had a hurricane recently, and I was one of the crazy ones that wanted to go watch the water be crazy.
Well,
but we're all different, right? Other times my neighbors were all in.
I love that reply. And actually, that's a really important point. I'm really glad you said it, because we each individually have a different tolerance for risk. And we can even have a high tolerance for risk in one area, like our business, or, you know, I don't know, something else we're doing, and a low tolerance for risk in another. So we're not all going to respond to the same. But the reason I ask that is because sometimes, and again, I'm not going to blame anyone specifically, but in maternity care and medical care, what happens is that people can make the increased risk in a particular situation sound like it's the difference between driving on a sunny day and driving in a hurricane, where only Deborah's going to go out and the rest of us are going to stay under a blanket. And actually, the actual risk is the difference between driving on a sunny day and driving when there's a bit of rain, which we're pretty much all agreed doesn't change our decision. So sometimes the risks are overinflated. And again, that's where I think it's really important to look at the numbers, and people like telling stories of danger. They like sharing scary stories. Same on the news. You don't see all the happy things that happened in a day. What you see are the really terrible things. And again, because that's what sells papers. If people only reported, who stood in the town centre and gave hugs for the day, and there was a fabulous dance band, people aren't going to click. So, and then I think the other element of that is that it's also really important to enable women and families to think about the bigger picture and say, well, is there actually anything we could do about this risk? Because often there isn't. And one example that I see so much of, particularly in the last few years, is women who are older and having a baby. And I want to say to them, this is awesome. Congratulations, go you. And there are some significant advantages to being older. I think, but they don't hear this. They hear it from me. People who are older, generally you have more financial stability. You're more likely to be living in your own home. I'm not saying you shouldn't have babies younger, but there are pros and cons to whenever in life you have a baby. But what women are actually told is, oh, well, you're quite old, so you are at risk, and your baby's at more risk. So these are all the things we're going to do. And almost within minutes, they're being told, well, you're going to need an induction, and the subtext is because we don't trust your body to be able to take care of this baby and grow and nourish this baby, when actually it's perfectly capable of doing that. There's no evidence. But the thing that really gets me with the older women is there's absolutely nothing that you can do to change that. Do you watch Doctor Who? I don't know whether you're going to get this reference, but unless you go and find Doctor Who and say, can you just take me in the TARDIS and knit me, which is a time machine, and take me back 10 years in time, there's nothing that we can do about it. And so you have to sort of ask how helpful it is that we're constantly going on about risks when there isn't anything we can do apart from create anxiety, get people worrying all the time and have them unable to experience pleasure and just spending their pregnancy being stressed.
Are you curious about enhancing pleasure and easing discomfort in labor? Orgasmic Birth and Dame present the Pleasure Vibe Fin, a waterproof vibrator designed to empower your journey through pregnancy, birth, and beyond. Boost your oxytocin, ease discomfort naturally, and transform your birth into an empowered and even orgasmic experience. Plus, support postpartum healing and reconnect with your body. Are you ready to embrace the power of pleasure? Click below, learn more, and start your transformation today. So many great examples. I really appreciate that, Sara, because, I had my first baby more than 40 years ago now, and we didn't have as many tests and things. So I feel, looking back, how blessed, because people were more celebrating. Like, I didn't have to navigate risk. It wasn't a word that really came up in my pregnancy. But in these last years, as you said, no one can navigate through without that word. And you brought up induction. I don't know in the UK if it's like the US, but I call it an epidemic. And so whether you're, having a baby a little bit older or maybe any other things in your life, but everybody's being told, right? 39 weeks and boom, we've got it planned for you.
No.
So I know you do a lot of work on that, and I know we weren't planning on talking really about induction, but would you say a word or two? And also, you have a great book, so I'd love for you to share how people could learn more to navigate induction risk.
Well, do you know what? It's interesting because induction was actually my PhD thesis, and
Ah,
I finished my PhD in 2008, and we're recording this in 2025. And I honestly thought I'd have been able to stop talking about it by now. And no, it's, every year since and I'm fine talking about it, but that just goes to show really how it, as you say, it's become a bigger and bigger deal all the time. And nowadays, as again, you've said it, I've said it, every woman is told, well, you're too big, you'll need an induction. Your pelvis is too small, we better get it out, the baby's too big, even though we've got no accurate way of measuring what the baby size is, and we know that the evidence shows that ultrasound is very inaccurate. The induction for due date, estimated due date, which is a whole can of worms. I'll better come back and talk about that one. But it just keeps getting earlier and earlier. And the message underneath is your body isn't adequate. Your body is not adequate to grow and to nurture this baby and to know. And we know that we don't know a lot about what starts labor, but we know that it's the baby as well. Your baby isn't capable of determining when it needs to be born, even though all the other babies in the history of the human species have known when they needed to be born. And so I've actually written two books on induction. I wrote the first one, I think it's now in its third edition, and that's called Inducing Labour, Making Informed Decisions. And I wrote that to help people to just understand what's the process of induction, when are the situations that it might be offered, what's the evidence for those situations, because in some that this is what's interesting, because in some situations, if you have conceived with assisted reproduction methods, for example, it is true that you do have a slightly higher chance of having a stillborn baby than somebody who has not conceived or has conceived naturally, however we want to say it. And so obstetricians will often say to women, well, then you should have an induction. But the thing is, there's actually no evidence, because there's been no studies that look at whether induction is beneficial or not. And we do know that induction has many downsides, long-term consequences. And what I know I'm sure you'll invite me to mention my website at the end, but I'm going to mention it now if it's all right. So
do.
anyone who wants to can. So my website is sarawickham.com, and there's no H on the Sarah, so SARAWICKHAM.com. And there are more than 200 free articles and blog posts on there. And there are more on induction than on any other topic, because over the years I've written about many elements of this. So I have the Inducing Labour book, which talks through what the process is like, because so many women just don't know that. They go in and they don't know that, for instance, they're likely to be sitting on an antenatal ward for 3 days before labour even gets going, and it's tiring. And and particularly in the UK, one of the main, women have a number of complaints, and there's studies about that on my website, but one of the key ones is that they weren't allowed to have their partner or family with them, and they were lonely and unable to sleep and having really painful sensations, because the drugs that are used, or the mechanical processes that are used to ripen the cervix in early labour, they can bring on quite painful sensations that they are doing things, but they don't feel productive to women, and women are told that not much is happening, and it's really demoralizing. And so that book is really about, again, because women aren't told, we're not told the risks of the interventions. They're so often told, well, this is the risk of carrying on, we want you to have this intervention because here's the risk of carrying on pregnancy, but they're not told these are the risks and downsides. And then the other book that I've written about induction was It's called In Your Own Time. I'm trying to think of the subtitle now. How Western Medicine Controls the Start of Labour and Why This Needs to Stop. And I wrote that because of exactly what you're talking about, the induction epidemic. I was so frustrated, and on almost every level, what women are being told is either not correct, or it's not the full story. And there was a huge guideline that was coming out in the UK. It was a revised guideline. And I found out ahead of time when this guideline was coming out. And I'd been part of the process of commenting on it. And I was so frustrated by what was coming in it. I mean, one of the things, for example, and we did manage to stop this, but one of the things was that there was a realization that Black and brown women had worse outcomes than white women. And at the time, it was 5 times women, Black and brown women were 5 times more likely to die in childbirth. And the national organisation, their answer to this was, well, let's offer induction. And there's that. I know
No.
there's absolutely no evidence for this. And in fact, offering induction to women who are already experiencing worse care is likely to increase the problem rather than decrease it, because we're putting them in situations where, if they're not monitored, things could go wrong. And so but this wasn't the only issue. It was women being told your baby's too big, you need induction. Anyway, I just thought I was really fed up. So I went to write In Your Own Time, and I just said, this is everything I know about the evidence in induction, why it's happening, and why we need to address this, really.
Yeah. And thank you so much for writing that book. I mean, your books, and as you said on your website, you have some great guides of even questions to ask and to understand, because it is an epidemic, and induction does really take away a
Yeah,
lot of the pleasure that's possible in birth, too.
absolutely. And I don't want to say like, oh, you can't experience pleasure if you have one of those, if you have a medicalized birth, because for some women, there really is no choice. There are some
Correct.
genuinely good reasons for induction. I'm certainly not one of these people that says we should never intervene. But yeah, as you say, we're causing this focus on risk is causing so many women to end up with intervention that they don't really need. And it's
Yes.
just getting in the way, not just of pleasure, but of their confidence. A dear friend and colleague, a wonderful midwife here in the UK called Caroline Flint, who you may have come across.
Yes.
She wrote something way back when I was a student midwife, so this is 30 or more years ago, and it stayed with me. And it was just a small article that she wrote, and she said that at the time when they're about to become a parent, parents to be, that's when they need to feel supremely confident, because they're about to start doing on their own, they're going to leave the hospital if they're in hospital, and they're about to start doing the most important job in the world. And we need them to feel confident. And what we're actually doing in systems of care is the very opposite. We are undermining and saying, you're at risk, you need to do these things. A study came out just this week which showed that 1 in 5 women in England, or in this study group anyway, but women in England are experiencing some kind of birth trauma. And it's not just about risk, but we're getting it really wrong, and we have to address this.
Yes. And thank you for saying too that, we can still find pleasure and really navigate when medical interventions are needed. And I agree with you. We're blessed to live in a time where so many people have access when needed, but it is that overuse. And you're so good with all your resources so that people can find the way to navigate that for themselves. And I want to lead into your newest book, because when this came out, I can't tell you how many people I quickly said, you have to get this book. So your new book, Plus Size Pregnancy, and you talk about ways the evidence doesn't match what women are being told. And I hear this all the time. So can you talk a bit about that?
I can. So, I mean, that book, I didn't necessarily want to write that book, but what I mean is that I realized that I just had to write it because, you know, I'd written about induction and ROGAM, as you call it in the States, we call it anti-D, vitamin K, group B strep, several of these decisions. But what was happening was that I was just increasingly hearing from women who are saying, I'm being told this because because I have a higher BMI and I can't do this and can't do that. And that almost got to epidemic proportions as well. And I thought, right. And when I started, I didn't know that much about the evidence in this area because I hadn't looked. And the one thing that I did know was that my experience in looking after larger women as an independent midwife, and I'm a larger woman myself, then for anyone that's not watching on YouTube, was completely different from what I was being constantly told when I would go into hospitals or meet, people who worked in hospitals, because their perception was that your uterus doesn't work so well if you're larger and you don't labor very well. And I know, and I was like, actually, there were two or three women, larger women who I'd looked after who had had really fast, really efficient labours to the point that other women were like, they were quite jealous. And anyway, so I did have a sense going in to writing this book that there might be a discrepancy between what women were being told and the evidence. And oh my goodness, that was definitely confirmed by my research. And we had obstetricians telling women, oh, you're at high risk of these things because of your size, and I want to be clear. So it is true, again, like I said earlier, it is true that there are some things that you do have a higher chance of if you have a higher than average BMI, and gestational diabetes and preeclampsia are a couple of examples of those. However, it doesn't mean that it's inevitable that you're going to get those just because you have a higher BMI. And lots of women who have an average normal, I mean, it's actually not average. That's what's kind of entertaining when you look at the medical measuring systems, which we've not got time for, but it's not actually average. Being larger is the average in terms of our population. But having a lower BMI, that doesn't mean that you don't have a chance of these things. And actually, I'm surprised I haven't said this yet. I really like to use the word chance instead of risk when I'm having direct conversations with women. It almost always means exactly the same thing, but it's not loaded. It takes the heat out of that term. So yes, so women who are larger, yes, there is a slightly higher chance of things, but it's not inevitable. As I was saying earlier, when you look at the actual numbers, it's usually not that much. It's the sunny day, rainy day car situation again. But here's the thing. This is the thing that is the most frustrating, really, is that often there are things that you can do to increase your chance of a good outcome, a physiological birth, a birth without so much intervention, if that's what you're aiming for. And those are things, this won't surprise you, those are things like having a midwife, having a water birth, giving birth somewhere out of hospital in a birth centre or midwifery led unit or at home. But the irony is that within our system, larger women are told, well, you can't do that. You can't, because you're large, you can't get in the pool. And in fact, I'll just mention that just recently, I've put out a blog post addressing that very thing. These are the reasons why actually that's a load of rubbish. And here's what you can say. It's one of my 7 ways to address, this problem. If you're told you can't have a birth pool because it's illogical, it's not evidence-based, and I would argue it's actually harmful, because having midwives, using water, are the very things that give you a higher chance of having a good outcome. And so not only should we not be denying them, we should be positively promoting them. And I know I promised you before we came on that I would get to this bit. What I also discovered was that there are actually, just like there are advantages to being older, there are advantages to being larger. But I think it's because our medical system and actually our culture in general is so fat phobic, is so biased against people of size generally, that these don't get talked about. And I don't know whether you've heard of this term. It's actually when you look at it, it's quite an offensive term. The term is the obesity paradox. And have you heard of that
No,
term?
I
Okay.
haven't.
So this term is used in medical care. And first of all, obesity doesn't mean anything. It's not a disease. There is no actual disease. It just means you're larger than average. Um, it's only paradoxical in a system which is kind of anti-larger people. But the obesity paradox describes this phenomenon, which as researchers we've known about for a few years, which is where researchers find that actually, contrary to all their biases and perceptions and thoughts, people who are larger actually have an advantage or have a better outcome. And I find it kind of hilarious in a way, because they're so stunned by this and it just smacks against their bias that they don't really know what to do with it. So often, no, so often they kind of hide it away. But I'm like a little detective going in there trying to find these things in the studies. So when it comes to pregnancy, there are several areas in which being larger actually brings you an advantage. And one of the main ones is that we very rarely see severe perineal tearing in larger women. Almost always, what we now call OAC, they're called different things. They were called third and fourth degree tears, but tears that involve the anal sphincter. Almost universally, these happen in women who are of average size or who are really slim. And another example, I'm going to let you read the book for all of them. Well, you have read the book, you'll probably know them. Another example is postpartum hemorrhage. So all women who put on, we all gain blood volume in pregnancy. It's normal. It's actually protective against a hemorrhage, because when we give birth to the placenta, there's always going to be some blood. That's inevitable and natural. And so building up the blood volume in pregnancy, it does a number of things, but one of them, is it's protective against hemorrhage. But women who are larger have more blood to lose. We have more blood volume in the first place. And so this actually also probably explains why we do better off in some situations in medical situations, because we have more resources. We can afford to lose 10% of our body weight in a sudden illness, and we're much less compromised than somebody who is smaller. So what we know in pregnancy is that larger women are being larger is protective against being compromised if you lose a lot of blood giving birth. So this is what's really interesting, because women aren't told this. Nobody's told, oh, you're larger, so great, you're really much less likely to have a severe tear. We're just told, well, you're fat, so this is a problem. You can't go in the pool, you can't have a midwife, you better come in, have an early induction, even though there's no evidence that that's going to help you either. So I'm really happy that I finished the book and that I've got the book out, because I think, not more than any group, everybody deserves to have this information, but it just felt so important to be able to help redress the balance and say, okay, I'm not going to say there's no risk in any of this, but actually here's the evidence in an honest way. I'm not trying to persuade you to do one thing or the other. I just want you to be able to take the actual facts and then make the decisions that are right for you.
Sara, what a gift you are. And this information, I could keep talking to you for the rest of the day,
I know, wouldn't that be fun?
yeah, it's so much fun, but it's so needed. And the reframing of risk to chance and being able to see that we're navigating. I love your analogy of the sun and the rain and the hurricane, where everyone needs to really navigate how they feel about each thing. Well, I know everyone listening could use a reminder. I know you said your website again, but can you say where people can find you, where they can get your books, and where they can follow you?
Absolutely. So my website is sarawickham.com, which is SARAWICKHAM.com. I have a newsletter. We send an email out once a week most of the year. I'm good at self-care and holidays. You'll be pleased to hear that. So I take
Yes.
holidays. But I update my website usually weekly, and we send an email out to let people know what's new on there. My books, all of my books are on my website. You can sign up for the email newsletter on the website as well. Or you can directly, I think there's a link at sarawickham.com/Sara News, SARANEWS. You can sign up for that. Yeah, and each of my books has a page on the website where you can find out more, and you can buy them anywhere. You can buy them Amazon, Waterstones, Barnes and Noble. But what I love mentioning is that we've on each book's website, on each book's web page, we've put its ISBN number. So if you like to support independent bookstores, you can go and get that number and take it to your independent bookstore and get them to order it in for you. And I think the last thing, I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram, and I'm Dr. Sara Wickham, but I think you're going to put that in the show notes anyway. So
Yes. We'll
and
put
thank you
all
for
of it.
having me.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And we'll put all of that in the show notes so that everybody, wherever you're watching or listening, just look below for all those links. And truly, thank you, thank you, thank you, Sara. It has been such a pleasure to have this time with you. And I know all our listeners are probably, their minds are spinning, right, everyone, thinking about all of this. And I hope helping you navigate so that you can keep your joy and confidence and pleasure in whatever way you approach pregnancy and birth. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was lovely to chat.
And for everyone, we always appreciate it. If you love this episode, please share it with friends, colleagues. We really help share if you would rate and review the podcast. I know I ask this all the time, but ratings and reviews actually then show us to more people. So if you feel this was valuable and can take a minute to do that, we would really appreciate it. And we hope you'll join us next week for the next episode of the Orgasmic Birth Podcast.